Map packs, loot boxes, battle passes, skin shops. Developers and publishers alike have used tons of different ways to try and monetize their products post-launch. And while we actually did a previous video kind of talking about the history of the live service game, today we're going to go a slightly different route and focus on some of the specific monetization models and talk about the pros and cons as opposed to just the history of it. Now, before we dig too deep, first we just need to lay out the base of what all the different models are that we're going to be covering, with the very big caveat, and this will get brought up a lot during the video, that many games combine multiple of these models to find the model that quote-unquote best fits their game. Very few games are using specifically one model only. That said, the major models that we're going to be covering today are map packs and also expansions or major content related DLC, battle passes, loot boxes or other RNG based pack openings, and then last but not least, I don't have a fancy name for this one, but we'll also just talk about the direct shop, where you can just buy specific skins, nameplates, emotes, or any other cosmetic or gameplay impacting item that you want at a specific price. So first, let's dive into the map pack. So for the sake of this video, where we are mostly focusing on live service multiplayer games, when we talk about map packs, we're talking about back in the day where you had a Halo or a Call of Duty or really basically any multiplayer game, and after the release you would get a set amount of DLC packs that usually contained maps, though it could also contain other different types of content like new game modes or cosmetics or various other things. You would be very familiar with these if you played any multiplayer game basically during the Xbox 360 or PS3 era. Pretty much all the games at that time were using this model, and mostly using it exclusively, with sometimes a few items that you could directly buy through microtransactions. Now this is a model that we haven't really seen for a long time, though Call of Duty tried to hold on to it for the longest and didn't get rid of it until Modern Warfare 2019, where they finally kinda shedded the purchasable map pack option. You used to also see these combined with season passes, where when you bought the game for $60 or whatever it cost, you could also buy the season pass, which would give you all of the major DLC for the first year after the game released. This would include all the map packs or anything else that they would ship out during that year. So obviously the gaming landscape has kind of gone away from map packs for a variety of reasons. However, before we kind of get into that, let's first talk about some of the possible pros that this model had. One positive is that you were directly paying for the content that you wanted. If you saw a map that you wanted, like you were a Halo 3 player and you wanted Foundry, or a Call of Duty player and you wanted that set of DLC maps, you would go and buy it, which is a lot different than now, where you just support a battle pass in hopes that you like the content coming out. In this case, if you didn't care for the maps or the game mode, whatever these map packs or content additions were adding, you simply just didn't buy it. This also lets you communicate directly with the developer. If it was low quality DLC that they were adding to the game, well then less people would end up buying it. Also, generally in games that had these systems, since this wasn't a seasonal model, and the game had to make the assumption that you might not buy this DLC, the game would be fully functional without them, and generally would have its own fleshed out progression system, completely independent of the content DLC. You can consider this a pretty big positive, because in a lot of cases these days with live service games, the battle pass can be almost the only form of progression. You also generally got more complete games, as developers had to make sure their game was worth buying and playing without the later added on DLC, because obviously you might not end up buying it. Now there were obviously cons to this model too, like for example the biggest one is the fact that it split up the player base. Since these content additions cost money, if you didn't buy them, you couldn't play them. So everyone that ended up buying these content additions could obviously play the new content like the new maps or the new game modes, but if you didn't buy it, you couldn't play it. Depending on the specific game, this would sometimes split up the queues you were in, and actually in certain cases made older Call of Duty games hard to find matches on if you had purchased the DLC, but in other cases where it was less behind the scenes like Halo, you just straight up weren't able to play certain playlists unless you purchased some of the different map packs. So if you didn't end up buying these map packs or these content additions, you weren't able to play at all. This in many cases meant that if you didn't want to buy the additional DLC, you might have been missing out on some of the best parts of the game if it didn't end up shipping with the main release of the game. There are many Call of Duty maps over the years that were DLC maps that probably would have gotten a lot more love if they had released with the base version of the game, or if you were a Halo player and you didn't want to buy the map packs, you might have missed out on some sweet custom games. Another big con to this was it could ruin playing with a group. If a certain player didn't have the content edition purchased, you wouldn't be able to play it, as every single person in the group generally needed to own the DLC in order to play it, and so you could end up in cases where if some of your friends didn't want to buy it, you might not even get to play the content very often, even if you yourself purchased it, unless you went and played on your own or with other friends who had purchased it. These content DLCs also usually came less frequently and less long-term than the seasonal updates we see now, as games using this model, especially during that era, did usually have a shelf life where they would have their set DLC and then they would move on to the next game or just shelf support altogether. One other thing, and you could take this either way, is that since the core game itself wasn't affected by these content additions, the core gameplay itself wouldn't really take drastic shifts. You wouldn't see a giant overhaul to the game because usually these map packs or different game modes that were being added were totally their own thing. They weren't going to touch the existing content that was there. Though that did leave with the possible upside that the base game was still going to be playable the way that you purchased it on the day you purchased it, outside of maybe some minor balance updates or bug fixes for game-breaking bugs. Obviously, this only lasted as long as the servers were still up. Another nice thing about this model is since it wasn't seasonal and it wasn't tied to battle passes, it was easier to come and go as you please. You could come in, play a little bit of a game, enjoy your time with it, move off to a different game, and come back when you felt like it, and didn't feel like you were missing out on different limited time content, because you could still go back and buy that DLC whenever you wanted, or you could come back and not even pick up the DLC and just play the same game that you had left before. So overall, the map pack model had its pros and also had its many cons. I don't think it's something we would ever really see return today, but it is interesting to go back and kind of re-examine what made the map pack model special and different than what we have today. Next up, we're going to talk about the Battle Pass. So I do just want to say the rest of the models that we're going to talk about in this video, they all have been kind of used hybrid together depending on the specific game, but we're going to break down the pros and cons of each of the models because there are definitely games that have focused on a specific model or employed only one. So the Battle Pass, if you don't know what that is, usually what that means is every X amount of months, 3 is usually the standard, although you know, some games like Halo Infinite like to have a 10-month season, you'll get a new season of content. This new season of content will come equipped with new maps, game modes, weapons, characters, whatever entails for that specific game. Along with this, you'll also usually get a new Battle Pass related to whatever the theme of the season is. This can be any amount of tiers, but usually the standard is 100, and this Battle Pass is going to consist of mostly different cosmetics. Skins, nameplates, logos, really anything to fill up the Battle Pass, to give you 100 tiers worth of content. A standard you'll see sometimes too is that the Battle Pass may also contain the premium currency, so that if you finish the entire pass, you'll actually make enough currency back to buy the next one. Now that isn't in every Battle Pass model, but it is pretty common across the board. Now Battle Passes pretty much unanimously have 2 different types. There's usually the free track, which is always going to be pretty limited in the items, and then the premium track, which is going to have the fancier skins and basically all the stuff that you want to unlock. Sometimes depending on specific games, you may see gameplay impacting items in here, but for the most part, the big games keep these passes to mostly cosmetic items. So for the pros, you know, the Battle Passes, they come in a pretty regular interval, whatever that amount of time may be. They also come equipped with regular new content for the game. Maps, game modes, it's going to put the game on a schedule and you can expect new content, whether or not it's going to be amazing content every single time, on a regular basis. Depending on the game, that may be 3 months, 4 months, whatever the length of the seasons are, you should expect to see new content pretty much every time a new Battle Pass drops. Now that isn't always the case, there's always going to be exceptions, but that's usually what you're going to see. Unlike map packs where you actually have to pay for the new content like the maps or the game modes, in a Battle Pass model, the actual gameplay content is going to be accessible and free to everyone, while the cosmetic content is going to be what gets locked up inside the premium Battle Pass. However, not everything about the Battle Pass is good. One, they are usually limited time. Now, we have seen games that'll let you go back and complete previous battle passes, but for the most part, the standard today is still that once that season is over, that battle pass is gone. And most likely you'll never be able to unlock those skins again unless they end up in a store or a future battle pass. This can end up with games sort of feeling like a part-time job, because if you want to complete the pass and get all the content out of it before the season ends, you are going to have to put in a fair amount of hours unless you end up buying a bunch of the different level tiers, because usually you can direct buy levels if you don't want to play enough to unlock all the different levels. Now, if you're someone that games all the time, you might not experience this as much, but if you're someone that has a lot more responsibilities and can only game a certain amount, you'll find it pretty hard to complete battle passes, especially if you're trying to play more than one game at a time. Currently, someone like me that does game a decent amount, I can usually only finish the battle pass for a game if I really focus on playing that game during a season. If I'm jumping between games or checking out different games, it's usually not something I'm ever going to complete, even when I end up purchasing them thinking I'm going to complete them. This is usually a bummer because they usually lock the best things toward the end of the battle pass, which tries to incentivize you to grind their specific game and not play other games. To me, that's a bummer because unless I'm really in love with a specific game at the time and go in absolutely grind mode, I do like to jump from game to game and have fun on different things, and that can be hard, especially if you're someone that has a lot of FOMO and you really want to get those skins, because who knows, 2 years down the line, you might kind of be sad that you missed that specific skin if you didn't grind out the battle pass, and that's definitely something that will get people onto a game, but not really get them onto a game for a good reason. Another con, and this isn't necessarily all across gaming, is that in many cases, the battle pass model replaces overarching progression. In a lot of games, it is the only form of progression. We've seen this in various games now. Halo Infinite, Overwatch 2, and many other games have gone the route of having the only progression model be the battle pass, which one is pretty boring because they're usually not permanent, and two is just boring because if you're not someone buying battle passes, your progression in the game is pretty minimal. There's also the downside that with these seasonal changes, sometimes depending on the specific game you're playing, the game can drastically change from season to season based on those changes, and you could see this as a good thing or a bad thing depending on how those changes kind of interact with the game. Every time there's a new Fortnite season, there's always people lamenting, saying X season in the past was better, or Apex, or whatever game is your fancy. There are definitely seasons that can make a game less fun to play with the different things that they add into the sandbox or different maps. Overall though, the battle pass model isn't bad. It just at times can be a little daunting, and when you have a lot of different games that you're trying to play, it can almost seem impossible to get some of the cool stuff toward the end unless you want to fork out a lot of money.
Oh, Chroma 3 live! Oi! Holy shit! Sweden pattern #1!
Next up, we're going to talk about the loot box model. Today, for the most part, gaming has gone away from this model because, well, to be honest, it's pretty exploitative, and there was various laws that were passed and a whole slew of other things that went down that kind of led to this. But if you play sports games and the ultimate team modes, that is the primary place you're going to see the loot box model today, along with Apex Legends that still employs it to some degree, though it's not necessarily a key point like it was in the original Overwatch. So the loot box model, if you don't know, is quite literally what it sounds like. It's a box where you open up and you get random items out of it. It could either be cosmetics or gameplay impacting items. If we're talking Ultimate Team, that is all RNG based. Usually the better stuff has lower odds of you pulling it, like a trading card pack, and for a while these were extremely popular. Like I mentioned, Overwatch, when it launched in 2016, really took these to the forefront, though games like Counter-Strike Go had been doing them with cases for quite some time before it, along with the obvious Ultimate Team modes, which still utilize it to this day. So there are some pros to the loot box model, not necessarily in every game, but usually in the games that implemented the loot box model when it was more popular, there was a way you could earn some of the loot boxes just by playing the game, though it may end up slowing down or stopping altogether as you level up or progress further into the game. In general, these loot boxes would also kind of fund the free content updates. So while sometimes if we're talking Ultimate Team, the loot boxes did contain gameplay impacting items, or I think there was a Call of Duty where you could get gun variants out of loot boxes, for the most part, loot boxes were cosmetic based, and they would fund the new content for the game. Or they would just let the developers make a ton more money, however you want to look at it. Now that pretty much ends it, I think, for the pros, and there are definitely cons to the loot box model. For example, it's extremely exploitative, takes advantage of that dopamine, it's pseudo gambling, especially in games like Counter-Strike where you could turn around and sell those skins, but in games like Overwatch, it's just exploitative because you're preying on people who want to unlock these cool skins, and they're just going to keep opening cases trying to get the specific ones they want. Obviously, the reason they're so exploitative is because of the RNG, which now I believe any game that includes them has to post the odds publicly, but in the past there would be cases where you didn't even know the odds of getting certain items unless someone did a bunch of testing. Overall, the loot box model was honestly pretty bad, and I'm glad to see it mostly being phased out of gaming, outside of obviously the sports games. But if I'm being honest with you guys, I don't play sports games, so Ultimate Team being infested with these things isn't necessarily my problem. The only time I really run into loot boxes these days is in a game like Hearthstone if I'm opening packs, because it's basically the same thing, though that kind of has its roots in real-world card games, which also are based around the same concept of opening packs. In general though, I'm very glad to see less and less games use this model, and I think seeing Overwatch recently go away from it with Overwatch 2 is a fantastic direction. Now last but not least, we're going to talk about the direct purchasable store. Now this is super straightforward. Basically, you have a store, it has items, if you want a specific item, you pay whatever the price is, and voila, you get the exact item that you want. This today is usually used in conjunction with a battle pass model, but in the past, games like League of Legends, a long time ago, did pretty much exclusively their monetization with a skin store. So the pros to a model like this is you just get to buy exactly what you want. If you see skins that you want, you buy them. If you see a bunch of skins that you don't want, well then you don't buy them. Now this can be a bit more of a problem if the store includes gameplay impacting items, as it can become pay to win extremely fast. Another issue that you can see is if the store uses limited time rotations, this can be there to capitalize on that FOMO feeling to make you buy the skin when it pops up, because once it goes away, you don't know if it's ever going to come back. And also you can argue if it's the only monetization model in a game, it's not as flashy and appealing as something like a battle pass. But for the most part, it's probably one of the most fair models there is, but like I said today, it's basically never used by itself. It's always used in conjunction with something like a battle pass. So that leads us to ask the question, what is the perfect model for games? Well, to be honest, that depends on you specifically. Are you the type of person that wants to jump from game to game? Or are you someone who wants to grind one specific game for a long time? Well, if you're the first type of person, you're probably not going to like a battle pass model as much. But if you're the second type of person who just loves the grind, then the battle pass model is probably something that you kind of enjoy. Are you someone who wants to pay for content updates or mostly just for cosmetics? Well, something like that is going to throw out whether or not you're going to want to pay for something like map packs. Questions like these are what you have to answer to determine what model or hybrid model is the one that you would enjoy the most. More and more games these days seem to go some form of hybrid version of a store with an accompanying battle pass. And while this was pretty cool at first and it seemed more consumer friendly, I do have to admit that the more games that go down this route, the less I end up purchasing these battle passes, or when I do, get anywhere near finishing them. Because like we talked about earlier, unless you want to spend a full season grinding a specific game, there just isn't enough time to play through all the various battle passes. Lately you can tell amongst many that there is battle pass fatigue starting to set in. And that's why the question keeps getting brought up if we should revert back to an older model that we used. While some point all the way back to the map pack or expansion model, this is a model that I honestly see never returning. Pretty much solely because the fact that it fractures your player base. Now Call of Duty was able to keep this charade up for years when basically the rest of gaming had abandoned it, but that was purely because of Call of Duty's popularity. Today I find it extremely unlikely that any developer would risk fracturing their player base again to sell map packs. Expansions are a slightly different story, as MMOs or MMO lights still use this model today. However, going the expansion route for a more standard multiplayer game, which was mostly the focus of this video, seems extremely unlikely, as that type of model doesn't really fit that style of game at all. And that's why usually in the past, those games would just end up getting sequels, or today, they just get new seasons. There is always the chance games go to a more direct purchase model across the board, but that clearly lacks the pizzazz and pull that the Battle Pass model entails. Because while we can say we are tired of Battle Passes, you can easily count up the amount of times a new season for a game drops, and you launch the game right up and hopped on in, ready to experience the new content and get the items out of the pass. And if for some reason you're one of the weirdo souls out there asking for us to return to the loot box model in more games, no, just no. Go play sports games and enjoy the Ultimate Team model if that's what you desire. All that said though, while the models of today may not be 100% my favorite thing, having the games that I'm enjoying continue to get content for years on end is pretty cool, compared to the past when even the most wildly successful of multiplayer products usually had a shelf life before the developer would move on to a sequel or a different game. So who knows, at some point there will probably be a new innovation in live service monetization to suck our wallets dry, but today I think we're stuck with what we have. I think we're going to continue to see battle passes combined with a store of some sort. Some games might throw loot boxes in here and there, but I think we'll see that less and less in new games, unless they're a mobile game, and then they're probably still gonna milk the crap out of you with those things. That, guys, is gonna do it for the video. Follow me on all the good places. Sorry if my voice sounded like shit. I am sick and I could barely record this video, and it's been a whole thing, trust me. Make sure you guys sub to me over on RAsh Live. That's where I stream these days. Other than that, follow me over on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll see you all next time.